September 1st, 1715, Versailles Palace. Louis XIV can't breathe. His leg is black, rotting from gangrene. The doctors huddle in the corner whispering. They've tried everything, prayers, bleedings, even cauterizing the wound with red-hot irons. Nothing works. The Sun King is dying. For 72 years, he's ruled France, longer than anyone in European history. He turned a rebellious nobility into obedient courtiers. He built the most magnificent palace the world has ever seen. He made France the superpower of Europe. But now, watching his own leg decay, he faces a terrifying truth. His heir is dead, his son dead, his grandson dead. All that's left is a sickly 5-year-old great-grandson. 72 years of absolute power, and it all comes down to a child who might not survive the winter. What if Louis XIV had died earlier? What if he'd never made it to 76? What if France's golden age had ended decades sooner? Quick favor, hit that subscribe button. Now drop a comment. If you had absolute power for 72 years, what would be your biggest regret? Stick around till the end. I promise you'll discover why Louis XIV's death might have been the best thing that ever happened to France. Louis XIV, the Sun King, born September 5, 1638, in the royal chaos of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. His childhood was brutal. When he was 5 years old, nobles literally stormed his bedroom during a civil war called the Fronde. Picture this, a little kid waking up to armed aristocrats standing over his bed, basically telling him, "We run things, not you." That memory, it haunted him forever. Here's what made Louis different from every other European king. First, he turned absolute monarchy from a theory into reality. Other kings talked about divine right, Louis actually lived it. Second, he was obsessed with control. Not just political control, everything. What nobles wore, where they lived, who they talked to. He literally made France's most powerful families move to Versailles so he could watch them 24/7. And third, the guy knew how to put on a show. He didn't just rule France, he performed France. Think of Louis XIV as the original influencer every morning. Dozens of nobles would fight for the privilege of watching him get dressed. Yeah, you read that right. Watching the king put his pants on was considered an honor. He turned daily routines into elaborate ceremonies, made himself the center of everything. The sun doesn't just shine, the whole world revolves around it. But underneath all that spectacle was a hardcore workaholic. This wasn't some lazy king partying at Versailles. Louis spent 6 to 8 hours every single day in council meetings, reading reports, making decisions, for 72 years. That's longer than most people's entire careers. Now, why does all this matter for today's video? Because the Louis XIV lying in bed with gangrene in 1715 wasn't the same glorious Sun King from 1660. This was a broken man watching his empire crack. His wars had bankrupted France. His religious persecution had driven out the Protestants who ran half the economy. His own family was dead, killed by smallpox and measles. The question we're exploring isn't just what if Louis died earlier. It's what if France never had those extra decades of his increasingly desperate, increasingly costly decisions. What if the Sun King's light had gone out before it burned France to the ground? That context changes everything we're about to discuss. Here's what you need to understand about France in 1715. The country was exhausted, not just tired, completely drained. For the past 50 years, Louis XIV had been waging almost constant warfare. The War of Spanish Succession alone had lasted 13 years and cost France everything. Hundreds of thousands dead, the treasury empty, peasants eating grass during famines, while Louis added another wing to Versailles. But Louis had won. Technically, his grandson sat on the Spanish throne. France was still the dominant power in Europe. The Sun King's vision of French supremacy had been achieved. At what cost, though? The population had actually declined. France had fewer people in 1715 than it did in 1700. Think about that. A major European power losing population not during war, but because the wars had been so devastating. Villages were abandoned, fields lay fallow, the economy was in shambles, and the debt astronomical. France owed approximately 2 billion livres, roughly twice the annual revenue of the entire kingdom. Imagine if your government owed double what it made every year. Completely unsustainable. Now let's talk about the succession nightmare. Louis's son, the Grand Dauphin, dead in 1711 from smallpox. His grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, dead in 1712 from measles. His great-grandson, the Duke of Brittany, also dead in 1712, the same measles outbreak. All that remained was one sickly 5-year-old great-grandson, the future Louis XV. Picture the scene in 1715. You've got a dying king who's ruled for 72 years. Nobody in France remembers a time before Louis XIV. He is France. And now he's about to hand everything over to a king. The nobles were circling like sharks. The same families Louis had spent decades humiliating and controlling. They saw their chance. The Parliament of Paris, which Louis had basically made irrelevant, was ready to reassert itself. Regional powers that had been suppressed were preparing to break free. Here's what actually happened in real history. Louis died September 1st, 1715, at age 76. His nephew, Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, became regent for young Louis XV. And honestly, it worked out pretty well for a while. Philippe was actually competent. He ended Louis XIV's religious persecution, brought back the exiled Protestants, stabilized the economy kind of, and kept the nobility from tearing the country apart. Sure, his regency was marked by financial schemes like the Mississippi Bubble, but France survived. The 5-year-old grew up. The monarchy continued. France even thrived in some ways. The regency period saw an explosion of art, philosophy, and culture. Without the old Sun King's rigid control, Paris became the intellectual capital of Europe. Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau, the Enlightenment was partly born from France's post-Louis XIV freedom. What if Louis had died earlier? Not as an old man in 1715, but in his prime. What if that gangrene, or one of the many other illnesses he survived, had killed him decades sooner? I want to examine 3 specific scenarios, 3 different death dates, each with radically different consequences. What if Louis XIV had died in 1661, right as he was consolidating power? What if he died in 1685, at the height of his glory? Or what if he died in 1700, before the catastrophic War of Spanish Succession? 3 scenarios. 3 completely different Frances. 3 alternate timelines that would reshape not just France, but all of Europe. Let's start with the earliest and perhaps most fascinating possibility. Scenario 1. Death in 1661, the sun that never rose. March 9, 1661, Cardinal Mazarin dies. In real history, this was Louis's moment. The 22-year-old king stood up and declared he would rule alone, without a chief minister. Absolute monarchy begins. The Sun King reads us. But what if, just days later, Louis collapsed? A sudden illness, fever, delirium, within a week, dead. France would have been thrown into complete chaos. See, Louis wasn't established yet in 1661. He'd been king since age 4. But Cardinal Mazarin had run everything. The nobles still remembered the Fronde, the Civil War where they'd nearly overthrown the monarchy. Louis's mother, Anne of Austria, was Spanish. Half the country didn't trust her. And Louis's brother Felipe was 21 years old, openly gay, more interested in fashion than politics. Who rules now? The ministers would have asked. The obvious answer, nobody really. Here's what likely happens in the immediate aftermath. Anne of Austria tries to establish a regency council. But she's not Louis XIV, she doesn't have that presence, that divine right confidence. The nobles smell weakness. The Parliament of Paris, which Mazarin had suppressed, immediately reasserts itself. The king is dead. We speak for France now. They start blocking royal edicts, demanding power sharing. Meanwhile, Felipe, who would technically be king, is completely unprepared. In real history, Louis kept him weak and distracted deliberately. Felipe had never governed anything. He'd never led an army. He'd been raised to be harmless. The great noble families start making moves. The Prince of Condé, who'd literally fought against the crown during the Fronde, sees his opening. All the people Louis would spend decades crushing. They're still powerful in 1661. France splinters, not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, inevitably. Think of it like a company where a strong CEO dies suddenly and there's no succession plan. Different departments start operating independently. Middle managers make their own decisions. Regional offices ignore corporate directives. That's France in the 1660s without Louis XIV. Southern France, which had always been semi-independent, starts ignoring Paris. Brittany, which had its own parliament, begins acting like a separate kingdom. Burgundy, Provence, Languedoc, All these regions with strong local identities start drifting away from centralized control. Now you might be thinking, wouldn't the monarchy still exist? Oh, it would exist. Felipe would probably be crowned king, but it would be a constitutional monarchy in everything but name. The Parliament of Paris would control the purse strings. The nobles would control the military. The provincial governors would rule their territories like independent princes. Basically, France would become what England became after its civil war, a monarchy constrained by parliament and nobility. Now let's talk about international consequences. This is where it gets really interesting. In real history, Louis XIV's France dominated Europe for 50 years. French became the language of diplomacy. French culture set the standard. French armies were feared everywhere. The Sun King's Versailles was the model every other European court tried to copy. Without Louis, none of that happens. Spain, which Louis spent decades fighting, breathes a massive sigh of relief. The Spanish Habsburgs, already in decline, get an extra generation of relevance because their main rival is suddenly weak and divided. The Holy Roman Empire, which Louis constantly undermines, strengthens. The Austrian Habsburgs don't have to worry about French interference in German politics. But here's the really wild part. England. England was in a weird place in 1661. Charles II had just been restored to the throne after Cromwell's republic collapsed. The country was trying to figure out what kind of monarchy it wanted. In real history, Charles II looked at Louis XIV's absolutism, and I thought, I want that. But Parliament wouldn't let him have it. In our scenario, with France weak and divided, Charles II's argument falls apart. Why should we give the king absolute power? Look at France. Strong king dies, everything collapses. At least our system has checks and balances. The English Parliament becomes more confident. Constitutional monarchy solidifies faster. And here's the kicker, England starts surpassing France economically way earlier. See, one of the biggest drags on French economic development was Louis XIV's constant warfare and his revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, which drove out Protestant merchants and craftsmen. In our scenario, with a weak monarchy that needs parliamentary support, France never revokes the edict. The Huguenots stay. French economy grows. Wait, so does France actually do better without Louis XIV? France becomes more economically dynamic. The rigid social structure Louis enforced doesn't develop. There's more social mobility, more innovation. The merchant class gains power faster. But France also loses its military dominance. Without a strong central monarchy funding massive armies, France can't compete militarily. The Grand Army that Louis built never exists. And culturally, Versailles is never built. French classical culture, Molière, Racine, Lully, doesn't get the same royal support. But other cultural centers flourish. Lyon, Bordeaux, Toulouse develop their own identities. France becomes more diverse, less In real history, France is preparing for the War of Spanish Succession. In our scenario, France is barely holding together as a unified state. When the Spanish king dies, who speaks for France? The parliament, the nobles, regional governors, they'd all have different opinions. France probably can't even make a unified claim, which means the Spanish throne goes to Austria by default. Whoa, no War of Spanish Succession. Europe avoids one of its bloodiest conflicts. Hundreds of thousands of lives saved. But the balance of power shifts dramatically. With Spain and Austria united under Habsburg rule, Central Europe becomes the dominant force. France, divided and weak, falls into the second tier of powers. October 18th, 1685. Louis XIV is at the absolute height of his power. He's just revoked the Edict of Nantes, banning Protestantism in France. Hundreds of thousands of Huguenots are fleeing to England, Holland, Prussia. But Louis doesn't care. Religious unity matters more than economic consequences. His palace at Versailles is the wonder of Europe. Every monarch wants to copy it. French is the language of diplomacy. The Sun King's power seems unlimited, and then he dies. Stroke, heart attack, doesn't matter. Dead at 47. This scenario is completely different from 1661 because Louis has already built his system. The nobility has been tamed. The bureaucracy is established. Absolute monarchy is the reality. His son, the Grand Dauphin, is 24 years old enough to rule. but completely unprepared. See, Louis XIV never trained his son to govern. He deliberately kept the Dauphin away from real power. Louis was paranoid about being overthrown, so he made sure his heir stayed harmless, good at hunting, bad at politics. The Dauphin becomes Louis XV in this timeline. He's not stupid, but he's weak-willed. He's been raised in his father's shadow, told his whole life that father knows best. Now suddenly, father is gone. His first major choice, what to do about the Huguenot. The economic damage from the revocation is immediate and obvious. Skilled craftsmen, wealthy merchants, talented artisans flooding out of France. Tax revenue drops. Entire industries struggle. The Dauphin's advisors split into factions. Some say, your father wanted religious unity. Continue his policy. Others say, your father was wrong. We need those Protestants back. Let's say the Dauphin makes the smart choice. He quietly stops enforcing the revocation. Doesn't officially reverse it, that would dishonor his father, but makes it clear Huguenots can return without persecution. This changes everything economically. The Protestant diaspora that strengthened England, Holland, and Prussia in real history. That doesn't fully happen. Many Huguenots come back. French manufacturing, banking, and trade remain vibrant. France in 1700 is wealthier than in real history. But it's also less militarily powerful because the Dauphin doesn't have his father's appetite for war. The 9 Years' War 1688 to 1697, which Louis XIV prosecuted with brutal efficiency, either doesn't happen or happens on a much smaller scale. The Dauphin isn't interested in conquering the Rhineland. He wants to consolidate what France already has. Europe breathes easier. The anti-French coalitions that dominated late 17th century politics fall apart. England, Holland, and Austria don't need to ally against France when France isn't aggressive. But without a common enemy, they start fighting each other more. English-Dutch commercial rivalry heats up. Austria tries to dominate Germany with less French resistance. Prussia rises faster. The balance of power shifts, but nobody's sure in which direction. Then comes 1700 and the Spanish succession crisis. The Spanish king dies. The Dauphin, now in his 40s, has to decide, does he claim the throne for his son? It's too good an opportunity to pass up, but he handles it differently than his father would have. The real Louis XIV was arrogant. He basically said, my grandson is king of Spain. Deal with it. The Dauphin, more conciliatory, tries to negotiate. He offers guarantees that France and Spain won't unite. He makes deals with England and Holland about trade rights. Maybe there's no war of Spanish succession, just tense diplomacy and small border conflicts. Or maybe England and Austria still form a coalition. But France is in a better position because the Dauphin hasn't spent 15 years alienating everyone. The war, if it happens, is shorter and less destructive. France doesn't bankrupt itself. The debt crisis that would later fuel the French Revolution never reaches catastrophic levels. By 1750, France is still a major power, but one among several, not the dominant force Louis XIV made it. November 1st, 1700, King Charles II of Spain dies childless. The question that would define the next 15 years, who gets Spain's massive empire? In real history, Louis XIV made his move immediately. His grandson became Philip V of Spain. Europe formed the Grand Alliance. The War of Spanish Succession killed hundreds of thousands and nearly destroyed France financially. But what if, just before the Spanish king died, Louis XIV died first? He's 62, old for the era. He's had various health problems. Let's say one finally kills him in October 1700. Now the situation is completely different. The Dauphin is in his late 30s, experienced but not his father. He's seen the costs of war. France has been fighting almost continuously for 30 years. The people are exhausted. The treasury is strained. When the Spanish throne becomes available, the Dauphin faces the same tempting offer. Make your son king of Spain. But does he take it? I think he hesitates. And that hesitation changes history. Louis XIV acted fast because he was Louis XIV, decisive, confident, aggressive. The Dauphin would want to consult advisors, consider implications, negotiate. That delay gives England and Austria time to organize. They propose a partition treaty, split Spain's empire between powers, prevent anyone from becoming too strong. The Dauphin, more cautious than his father, seriously considers it. His military advisors say, take the throne, we can win. His economic advisors say, take the partition, war would bankrupt us. His diplomatic advisors say, take the partition. We can't fight all of Europe. Let's say he takes the partition. Philip of Anjou doesn't become king of Spain. Spain's European territories get divided. Austria gets the Netherlands and most of Italy. France gets some border territories. Spain itself goes to a minor Habsburg prince. No war of Spanish succession. Think about what that means. The deadliest war of the early 18th century just doesn't happen. 400,000 soldiers don't die. Countless civilians aren't caught in the crossfire. The treasuries of France, England, and Austria aren't drained. Europe in 1713 looks completely different. France hasn't bankrupted itself. When Louis XV, the real one in this timeline, inherits the throne, he gets a financially stable kingdom. Britain hasn't spent 13 years building up its navy. British colonial expansion happens slower. Austria hasn't exhausted itself. It can focus on Central Europe and pushing back the Ottomans. The ripple effects continue. Without catastrophic war debt, France's finances remain stable. The Mississippi bubble scheme might still happen, but the collapse is less devastating. French economy in the 1720s to 1750s grows steadily. The merchant class prospers. The American colonies develop faster because France can invest instead of paying war debts. But I need to be careful here. We can't trace every butterfly effect through centuries. What we can say, France, entering the mid-18th century with stable finances and less international resentment, fundamentally changes the kingdom's trajectory. So which scenario is most likely, and which is best? Let's break it down clearly. Scenario 1, death in 1661, creates the most dramatic change. France never becomes the dominant European power. It develops more like a constitutional monarchy, unified but with checks on royal power. This prevents French military aggression and saves countless lives and avoided wars, but also means France never achieves the cultural dominance it had in real history. Without centralized royal patronage, French culture develops differently. Versailles doesn't exist. The arts flourish in regional centers instead of Paris. France becomes more economically dynamic but less culturally unified. Scenario to death in 1685 is the middle path. France remains powerful but less aggressive. The Dauphin can't maintain his father's level of control or ambition. Europe is more balanced. Fewer wars, but still conflicts. France stays relevant but not dominant. This is probably the best outcome for French prosperity. The kingdom doesn't exhaust itself through warfare. The economy develops naturally. The social structure is less rigid, which could prevent revolutionary tensions later. Scenario 3, death in 1700, prevents the specific catastrophe of the War of Spanish Succession. Louis XIV has already built a system, already conducted most of his wars. The major difference is avoiding that final bankrupting conflict. France in 1715 is still powerful, still absolutist, still culturally dominant, but it's financially stable. The 18th century develops on a completely different foundation. Now, here's the uncomfortable truth. From a purely French nationalist perspective, Louis XIV's actual reign was probably optimal, at least short-term. Yes, he bankrupted the country. Yes, his wars killed hundreds of thousands. Yes, his absolutism created conditions for eventual revolution. But he also made France the dominant European power. He created French cultural hegemony. He built Versailles. If your goal is French glory and international prestige, it's hard to argue against Louis XIV's actual choices. If your goal is human welfare and peace, it's a different story. The wars Louis XIV fought killed somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million soldiers, plus countless civilians. The War of Spanish Succession alone killed around 400,000 people. His revocation of the Edict of Nantes destroyed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Protestants. Any scenario where he dies earlier means fewer deaths, less destruction, less human misery, but it also means less glory, less grandeur, less of that magnificent obsession that built Versailles and made France the center of European culture. Is that trade-off worth it? I can't answer that for you. History doesn't give us clear moral scorecards. What I can say is this: the long-term consequences of Louis XIV's rule were largely negative for France. The debt, the rigid social structure, the absolute monarchy resistant to reform. These created the explosive tensions that erupted in 1789. If Louis had died earlier, France probably would have evolved differently, more peacefully, more sustainably, with less glory but more stability. Think about it from a different angle. We love our great men in history: Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, Napoleon. We tell their stories, celebrate their achievements, build monuments to their glory. But maybe the greatest leaders aren't the ones who achieve the most spectacular things. Maybe they're the ones who leave their countries in a position to thrive after they're gone. Louis XIV was a sun king, but when the sun sets, what's left? In his case, a 5-year-old heir, a bankrupt treasury, an exhausted population, and a social system so rigid it eventually shattered violently. If he died earlier in any of our 3 scenarios, France would have been forced to adapt, to evolve, to find a more sustainable path forward. And maybe that's the real lesson. Sometimes the best thing a great man can do for his country is get out of the way. Louis XIV ruled for 72 years because he could, because he had the strength, the will, the obsession to hold on to power until his body literally rotted. But France might have been better off if he'd let go sooner. If he'd have died at 62, or 47, or even 22, each of those deaths would have been tragic, each would have been mourned. But each might have saved France from the catastrophe his long reign ultimately created. The Sun King burned bright, maybe too bright, and when he finally went out, he left France in darkness, stumbling toward a revolution that would shake the world. Could that have been avoided, based on what we've explored? I think the answer is yes. France didn't need 72 years of Louis XIV, it needed 20, maybe 30, enough to establish stability and cultural achievement, but not enough to exhaust a kingdom and build a system incapable of reform. So here's my final answer to our original question. What if Louis XIV had died earlier? France would have been less glorious but more stable, less dominant but more prosperous, less absolute but more adaptable. And in the long run, that might have been exactly what France needed. We started with a dying king, his leg black with gangrene, watching 72 years of absolute power come down to a sickly child. We've explored 3 alternate timelines, 3 different moments where Louis XIV's death could have changed everything. Die in 1661. France becomes a constitutional monarchy, less glorious but more economically dynamic. Die in 1685. France keeps its power but avoids the worst excesses, remaining strong without exhausting itself. Die in 1700. France dodges the War of Spanish Succession, entering the 18th century financially stable instead of bankrupted. Each scenario has trade-offs. Each sacrifices something: glory, dominance, cultural supremacy for something else: stability, peace, prosperity. But here's what they all have in common. In every scenario where Louis XIV dies earlier, fewer people die in wars. France develops more sustainably. The conditions that led to the bloody French Revolution are less severe or absent entirely. The Sun King's actual 72-year reign achieved magnificent things, but it also planted the seeds of France's eventual catastrophe. Sometimes greatness comes at too high a price. Sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can do is step aside before their vision becomes their country's burden. So I'll leave you with this question. Would you rather live under a glorious empire that eventually collapses into revolution, or a stable, prosperous kingdom that never quite achieves greatness? There's no right answer, but it's worth thinking about as we look at leaders today who refuse to let go of power, who believe they alone can guide their nations, who stay too long and leave chaos in their wake. The Sun King ruled until his body literally rotted. History remembers his glory, but maybe France would have been better off if he'd left earlier, while there was still light instead of just heat. If you enjoyed this dive into alternate history, check out our video on the reason why Alexander never lost a battle. Another fascinating look at how one moment can change everything.